Hello and welcome to Old School Garage. My name is Nicholas, and today I'm going to be talking about my Auto-Pilot unit that is on my 1961 Imperial. This is not select to my 61 Imperial. It was on 58 and on Imperials for a while, and then it was also on some GM cars and some Ford cars as well. But this just belongs to my 61 Imperial alone. It was made by Perfect Circle, the people who made Perfect Circle piston rings, and we'll get to that in a second. But this is just a basic disassembly. I'm going to show you how everything works, what everything's intended purpose is, and some testing of it to make sure that it's in good shape before we put it back on the vehicle, and some other maintenance things that is needed. So before I get started with that, I'd like to say a special thank you to ProTech Powder Coating for sponsoring my channel. I'd like to point you towards them if you need anything powder coated or ceramic coated. Talk to Frank and tell him that I sent you, and he'll be able to help you out with anything that you need in that realm. They do frames, headers, anything you want powder coated, they can handle it. So reach out to them and they'll take care of you. Now specifically on this guy, this is the first ever cruise control unit truly ever made, if you want to call it that, or produced for like production vehicles, not a prototype or anything like that. It was select to Chrysler in 58. It was the first, Chrysler was the first manufacturer to have a cruise control unit like this. In 59, GM adopted the same unit, and we'll get a little bit into the manufacturing of it in a little bit, talking about how it's very universal. But it was offered in Chrysler first, and then everyone picked up after that using this. Now, this is considered, it's Autopilot according to Chrysler. And I believe that term was used up until 65, but they eventually dropped that and just went for the adage of cruise control, which GM had already been using, and it just makes more sense to go with cruise control than autopilot. So let's get into the history of how this guy came about, and then we'll begin the disassembly, cleaning, and all that. Now, this brief history that I'm about to talk about, all the sources are available in the description. If you want to go read more about them or more in depth and basically find where I've gotten my information from, you can look those up in the description. But mainly the history of this, I'm just going to be focusing on where I think it came from. I'm not going to be focusing on the inventor's life, and that's a whole nother rabbit hole in itself, but I'm just going to be talking about the creation of this. Now, the creation of cruise control is credited to Ralph Teetor, who was the CEO, or became the CEO of Perfect Circle Manufacturing, and we would know them today as like the Perfect Circle piston rings. They made piston rings, but they also made these. Now, Ralph Teetor was an inventor. So originally he had the Speedometer, which came out in 1950, or was patented in 1950. Now, that was a pedal-driven unit, and so the pedal would be here, and then you have the unit mounted underneath. So it's slightly different from this, but the same concept of when you would press the pedal, you would set a dial to a specific speed, and the pedal would give you resistance once you have met that specific speed, using a governor inside the unit to basically regulate how everything's running. And we'll get to that when we get to the disassembly, but it's a very similar design. The one that was patented in 1950. That one was vacuum driven. This one is slightly different, mainly for the fact that it is electronically driven or electrically driven with a DC reversible motor. Now, Ralph Teetor was heavily involved with the US military from World War I all the way through World War II. And I believe he got a lot of the inspiration from the Army Air Corps and the US Navy, mainly with what he was working with on like steam turbines and US warships. I think he kind of gathered some inspiration, and this is my personal opinion, he gathered some inspiration from autopilot systems, if you want to call it autopilot, on ships and airplanes. So they have their own systems where you can set headings, and basically the mechanical system will maintain a certain heading using a cardinal compass, and we'll be able to figure that out itself by you just setting a heading on a dial. So it's kind of the same concept here, but for a car, and obviously you can't set a heading on a car because you still need to steer, and then the heading is constantly changing. You're not at open sea or open air. So the only thing that this can control is simply the motor to keep the vehicle going at a specific speed. Now, a benefit of having this electrical motor on here, it allows you to control the pedal directly through the throttle linkage, which would hook up to this lever right here. And whenever you got to your set point, the motor would control the pedal linkage in that specific area, and you basically would have feedback on the pedal. So you can set the speed to whatever you want. So 40 miles an hour. When you reach 40 miles an hour, there will be a speed reminder, and that speed reminder is simply there to put pressure back on the pedal so you know, hey, I'm at 40 miles an hour, because we don't want to look at the dash, or at least that was the idea. So it's very intricate design, but it was also designed around being universal. Now, the reason I'm saying it was designed to be universal, there are little things that you can tell that they did, mainly that this is a mobile unit. It's not mounted underneath a pedal like the original style was, where it would be mounted directly underneath. So this could be mounted anywhere between the speedometer and the transmission. So as long as you were able to get linkages there and cables there, you were good to go. So it was a very mobile unit. Another feature was the interchangeable speedometer connection. So you could use whatever brand speedometer cable you wanted, or that was the idea, and connect it to whatever transmission you wanted. So you just would change this top piece out, and we'll get to that in the disassembly, but you would be able to change this top piece out, and it could be used for whatever brand you wanted, which eventually this would be used by Sears as a universal cruise control unit for a car that you had. Now, as I said before, Chrysler was the first to have a cruise control unit within their cars. I believe GM had like some speed buzzer type system where you got to a specific speed and it would buzz, but that was prior to this. So in '58, Chrysler released their Imperial lineup with the cruise control, and then '59 Cadillac, and around '60 for Ford. Now, these units stayed fairly similar throughout the years, but there is a period of time where they did go through a slight change, and that would be around '63 when the Dana Corporation would eventually purchase Perfect Circle, and along with that, these units. So there were some slight changes later on, specifically with the GM cars especially, that there would be some changes to internal design features, less metal, more plastic, stuff like that. So in essence, Ralph Teetor was a very, very brilliant man. He had a lot of really interesting inventions, and I do recommend you go check him out and see all of his history. But it took a very smart person to design this and be able to make it to where any company could be able to use it. And I think that's part of the brilliance of this, is it fairly was easy to manufacture. Like, the parts that they used were not complicated. There was nothing extremely special to it. And it was able to be swapped between multiple brands with ease. So it really made it a very universal part. Like, I can't stress that enough. Very brilliant design, and he's definitely a very brilliant inventor. So now we're going to step into the disassembly range of this video, and I would like to stress that I am no expert on these. I have not worked with these prior to this vehicle. I have only used manuals to reference stuff, and I've found some forums that talk about it kind of lightly. But I would also like to stress that if you are getting into anything like this and you don't feel comfortable taking something like this apart, I really stress that you do not, especially taking anything apart and then adjusting. This does take control of the motor, or specifically the throttle linkage. So there is a possibility that you could have a slight runaway situation if it's not adjusted correctly or put back together correctly, if something is not aligned as it should be. So that would obviously cause danger to you inside the vehicle. It would cause danger to the property that you're driving, the vehicle itself, and everyone else on the road, and possibly houses or anything like that. So, treat this with respect, that it does control something that is kind of important. So there are some redundant safety features that are built in, and they're there for a reason, and we'll get to that later on in the video. But we're going to get to the disassembly now, and we're going to first show all the tools that you will basically need, and just like a basic summary of the tools you will need. And then we'll get into exactly what needs to be done to take this guy apart correctly and put it back together correctly. While we're doing that, I will be talking about what each function of each part is, so that it is a little bit more understood of how this system works. Now, what we're going to begin with is all the tools and parts that you will need. So first thing you're really going to need is a good hammer, an 1/8" pin punch, a wrench of some sort. This is an adjustable wrench by Knipex, and some pliers. You're going to need some snap ring pliers, and they need to have a really small pin, very small. A good set of picks, because you're going to need to pry some gaskets, some rubber O-rings. A good soft hammer, whether with a brass end or plastic end. You're also going to need a smaller screwdriver and then bigger screwdriver, both common. You'll need a set, or not a set, but you'll need one Allen key. Now I've converted some of these screws, so I have more Allen keys than you would normally need. A good set of tweezers. You're going to need a set of forceps if you have bigger hands. If you don't have bigger hands, you still might want them because it should just make things easier. A good paint marker. A set of ignition wrenches. Specifically, they need to be 3/8. And then you need a 12-volt battery source. This is just a Milwaukee 12-volt battery. Now, another thing you're really going to want is a manual for your vehicle that has these. Now, if you don't have a vehicle that came with this and you just happen to have one of these units on here, I would recommend getting the 60 Imperial service manual and then the supplement for 61. These would be very helpful to you. The 61 specifically for adjustment of the autopilot system, and then you would want, see, it shows everything that you would really ever need. Any adjustments, any diagrams you need, anything you would really need. Here's a good diagram, the disassembly of everything. So definitely a manual. If you've never taken one apart, even if you have taken one apart, I would highly recommend getting a manual that has a diagram and adjustments of these, just to make yourself have a little fallback point if something goes wrong or you can't remember where everything goes. So let's start on this guy. Now again, let me preface this. If you don't feel comfortable taking this apart, do not take it apart. You can just take the cover off, do some lubrication where you need it, and be done with it. You don't need to take the whole thing apart. Now, I would also like to say that I've already cleaned this very thoroughly and have already taken the time to, I haven't lubricated anything, everything is dry right now, but I've already taken it apart and then painted some parts, specifically this, and then one of these screws stripped on the way out, and I had to replace it. So these are not original screws. These would be common here, common screws. So the first step of the disassembly is the 4 screws on the outside. Now originally these 4 screws would have been 8-point bolts or screws. I've replaced them with hex because I don't have an 8-point socket, and then I like the look of these better. So that's just a little tidbit of information if you wanted to make it look original. Now these screws are just 832 screws and around like a 1/4 inch long. They don't go all the way through the case, but you will pry this guy off, and we'll start with the disassembly of the lid. Now there's 2 seals that seal this entire case, really 3 if you want to get technical. You have this rubber O-ring that goes around the outside, and then you have a felt seal here and a felt seal underneath this guy right here. So to get this out, you're going to want to start with the felt seal. Just gently pry out, don't rush it. There's your felt seal. And then your O-ring, just gently pull. If you get stuck in a spot, take the pick, just gradually run underneath it. It'll pry right out, or it should. If you need to, you can take a hairdryer or a heat gun and heat it up. And there you go, you're disassembled for the cover. Now, obviously there's no sticker here. If you had a Cadillac, it would have been blue with, it would have said cruise control. The Chrysler says Auto-Pilot, and then it has a specific part number. I'm putting a sticker on that has a different part number than the original, mainly because I can't find one that matches my part number. So, little tidbit, but really not that important. So now we're done with the cover. Now here is the main unit. This is where your throttle hooks up. You have your main electrical connectors. These will both, or all three of them will have 12-volt ignition source to them. We have our governor weights over here. We have our draw rod, which is right here. We have our hold down latch for wide open throttle. We also have our points here. These are directly connected to the governor. And these basically just ground the connection out wherever. So the 12-volt coming in goes to the motor, and then each side will ground, and whichever side will push the motor that way. There is a worm screw underneath all this, which we'll see here in a few, that is driven by the motor and will push this unit back and forth. So to test this, we can hook up our 12-volt battery source and just simply ground the case. Apply 12 volts here, and then by manipulating the flyweights, we can you can see the motor move and adjust wherever it needs to go. And then in theory, obviously, this guy would be falling back. So we know the motor's working. We know that everything is moving correctly. I did have to press a little hard here, so we're just going to make sure our contacts are good when we get everything disassembled. All right, so now to begin the disassembly of this, we're going to start with taking the spring off. This spring is going to relate to around 5 to 7 foot-pounds on the pedal when you're pressing it. So first things first, we're going to remove these. And these will both come off. These are your throttle linkages. And the first thing that we're going to take off, that really needs to be taken off, is there's a nut down inside there. Now to get to that guy, we're going to need to remove a screw right here. So to get this screw removed, you're going to want to have this entire assembly pushed that way so that you can actually get to the screw. We're going to take this guy off. Just need to get it loose so that you can pull the contact off later. Now we're going to hook up our 12-volt battery source, apply voltage to the terminals, and then, whoops, we're going to get the motor all the way over. Now on this opposite side, there's a screw right in there. We're going to loosen that. It is also a spade connector, or not a spade connector, but a fork. We're just going to simply loosen that connector enough to where we can pull the connection off, like that. At this point, you want this assembly pushed as far away from the motor as possible. We're going to pull both connectors off. We're then going to push the red wire, which has to loop around the axle right there. We're going to take this connector, push it through so it comes out the other side, and then we're going to grab our wire. The reason I swapped to these tweezers is simply so I don't mar the wire jacketing. So we got both wires out. We can just push them out of the way. We're then going to unplug this guy, actually both of them. And then we need to pry them just a little bit out of the way, like so. Now there's a nut right there. What we need to do is loosen said nut. All right, now that we got that nut off, we can move these wires out of the way. Pull these guys through. We're just going to move these right over here. Now, there's a 3/8 nut right there. So we are going to take that off. And then there is a nut on this back side right there. Make sure you're supporting the motor, and then you are going to pull the motor right through. Fish the connectors through, and there's your reversible motor off. Now at this point, you can remove the connector board, which is one common screw, like so. We are now going to focus on getting this governor spring off. So to get this guy off, the first thing we need to do is take the cable nut off of this back side here. Now the part I'm talking about is this guy right here. This connects to the switch and the dial on the dash, and there is a ball that slips in here, and then the cable slides in between that crevice right there. When you adjust the dial, you're pulling this guy, which is applying more tension to the governor weights. So to get this guy off, there's a few things you're going to want to do first, and this is where the paint marker will come in. You can compress this spring or disconnect this spring, but you're going to want to compress it enough to where you can mark this guy where you're at, and then you're going to unscrew this off. Now I already know that this is 7 turns from this edge right here. So this edge and then this ball, 7 turns off is, that's my adjustment that I need to remember. Yours may be different, I don't know, but it should be close. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All right, now that we have that off, we're going to take this guy and it will pull right out. Now you can leave these attached, you don't need to take them apart, but if you needed to, you would bend one of the tabs back and then pull the band through the spring and you'll be good to go. Otherwise, you can just leave it intact. It's probably going to be a little bit rusty, so you can clean that up if you'd like. Now that we have the rod out, we can see our governor weights more, which they pull this guy right here. So you have, these are big L's, the governor weights. When they're swinging, they swing out, and there's feet on the bottom that push this guy up and down, which is connected by a lever to these points, which is how the system knows. So it grounds it out and says, hey, I need the motor to go this way or that way. So our next step is we're going to be taking this entire unit out. So it just slides out once you undo the 3 screws on the side. The 3 screws, one being an Allen screw, and then 2 being common. So to get it out, you need to crack those screws free. The long screw goes on the farthest side because it needs to attach this wide open throttle switch. Just remember that. And then your Allen screw goes on the other side towards the tag where the screw mounts, the worm screw mounts, so that you have a stop here. That is very important. And then you're going to pull straight up. Like so. Now, these little grooves right here fit on this screw. They fit directly down over that, so that when the screw is spinning, it's moving this back and forth. Just need to take this guy out, clean it. If you need to replace the bearing, you have access to do so now. Use a bearing puller. All right, now to get this guy out, we are going to take the 3 screws that hold it on right here. Now this is how the tag was mounted. I don't know if that's original or not. It was just simply not put on the 3 screws. I don't know why, so I'm going to leave it that way. But we're going to take the 3 screws out, and then we will be able to tap the worm gear out. The retaining plate, which is this guy right here, this guy, should spin freely or be loose in there. It's not going to come off, but to get this guy off, you're going to very gently tap it out. Now, if you don't need to take this out, you don't have to. I'm just showing so that if someone does need to take it out to replace the bearing, they know how to. So to get this out, we're going to line our pin punch up here, get this guy all the way down to the end. We're just going to take our pin punch and very gently tap it. And then we should be able to grab it to pull it out. So now we have our worm screw off. And as you can see, there's one bearing there, and then there's no bearing on this side. Now, this screw is very ingenious. You can see there's roll pins. I'm trying to make sure this focus is good so you can see it. There's roll pins on each end, and there is a sleeve beneath the nut. Now, the purpose of this sleeve is so that when this rotates all the way to the end, this screw will continue to rotate and not bind up. So it won't crash against that roll pin. So it can still spin back this way, but when it gets to that roll pin, you can see that little sleeve there. Once that sleeve comes around, there it is, it won't spin any further. Very cool. Now what we have left is the governor weights and then the speedometer gear. So we're going to take the speedometer gear out first because we need to get that out first. You don't want to remove this, the governor weights and the shaft with the governor weights, without removing the speedometer adapter first. So this is the direct drive from the transmission. So there would be a cable going to this, and then this just has a gear inside here, and we'll show that in a second. That goes directly to the speedometer. So we need a screwdriver, and we're going to take all these tiny guys out. And you're going to pull this guy straight up. I just want to show that. So there's a oil light bearing in here, or bushing, and then you just have the adapter. Yours may look different depending on what brand vehicle or what kit you have. Then we have our speedometer gear, which you can see is plastic. You want to make sure that this is properly lubricated. So if anything that you take apart, make sure that you pop these 3 screws off, pull this guy out, and make sure that it's properly lubricated. That is very important, otherwise you could risk chewing this up, and then you need to find a replacement, and good luck doing that. And now what we're going to do is take a tiny little pin punch, 1/8 inch is what I'm using, just seat it down inside, and then we're going to, actually hold up, can't be doing that. Almost forgot, you need to remove the screws first. That would have not been good. And this just holds the bearing in for the governor. Make sure it doesn't come out. Now, once you have this plate loosened, you're going to flip this guy over and very gently tap this out. It does not take a lot of effort. I'm just simply directly into the center of the shaft, and we're just going to, I'm very lightly tapping. See, I just basically could have probably pushed it through. And then we have our bearing out. The only thing left attached to this is this guy, which comes right out. And this is just the adapter for the cable. There's a whole nother unit that attaches to the ball end, which connects to this guy in here. Now we're done with this. This guy is pressed in here. I don't recommend removing it unless you absolutely need to. If you are going to remove it, do not remove it from the thread side, like pushing it this way. You need to push it back out that way. It does look like it has some sort of staking or something going on, so it's probably in there pretty good. So we're done with the main case. And then here we have our governor, flyweights, whatever you want to call them. This is the governor unit. Our main carrier bearing, and then our lower carrier bearing, and then our gear shaft, which connects directly to our speedometer gear, which is this guy. So this comes from the transmission to the speedometer. If you don't want to use the cruise control unit, that's fine, like if you disconnected it, but you still need to have this connected in order for your speedometer to work. So here we have our drive motor, and it is a DC reversible motor. You have 3 different parts to this motor. You have the stator housing right here, the center section, you have your end caps, and that's it. And then we have all the internal stuff. But there's 2 screws right here, 1 and 2, that are threaded into this end cap right here, and they need to come out in order to get the motor apart. So let's do that. All right, now that we got the screws out, we can pull our end cap off. Make sure you're fishing the wires through. Now we're going to pull the end cap off. There we go. All right, there we go. We have both end caps off. Now, you can go a step further. You need to keep in mind that you have brushes here. So when you pull this out, the brushes are going to come with it. So I'll show you an easy way. You can hold the wires, and then there's your rotor. So if you need to, you can clean this edge. I can't point to it. Let me put this guy back. You can clean this edge right here if you need to. Just take some Scotch-Brite and lightly scratch or scuff it. This one definitely does not need it. So we're gonna put it all back together. To put this guy back together, we need to remember which way we had it on, which went like that. And then we're gonna take some 30 weight oil. I just have it in a squirt bottle. We just need to get a little bit of oil on the end. And then we are going to slide this guy back on. And we're gonna smear the oil on. And then we're gonna slide the oil light bushing over like that. Then we gotta line our screws up. Make sure your little plastic bushing is seated back and you're good to go. You're done with the motor. Now for this guy. So we are not done taking this guy apart, and this guy comes apart actually fairly easy. This end right here simply slides off. It is attached to the point right there. And then we're going to separate that guy. Make sure you clean this guy out. You want it to be nice and clear. And then we're going to take some Scotch-Brite and we're going to scuff this point up. Now we're just trying to clean this up a little bit. It does look like someone's been here. We're just trying to get the scuffing that was on it off. And then we're going to use some spray grease. It's white lithium grease. You want to use a white lithium grease. And you're going to apply it to the oil light inside there. Now we're going to set that aside. We are going to go back to this guy, and now we are going to remove this shaft. Now you don't usually have to do this, but I'm doing it to show for the video. You need to get your snap ring pliers. Get the little guy off, don't lose that. And then this slides off. And so does this guy. So this guy does move, like so. That's just to take up slack. But you can take this apart further if you need to. I don't need to, so I'm going to leave it together. But we're going to spray some grease down in there, and the same with this back side, just to get it some grease within it. But first we're going to take some Scotch-Brite again and clean all the points. Now you also have a bushing in here, which gets this guy. So you want to make sure that that is lubed good, and this outer washer area. Make sure it's moving nice and easy. All right, and then we're going to take our points. We're going to put this guy, whoops, on like so, moving a lot better now. And then we're going to put our snap ring back on so we're not losing nothing. You want this ball end facing towards the governor spring, so away from this solenoid here. We also want to make sure our points in here, everything is good. They're contacting correctly. Same with this switch right here. Make sure our points are intact. There's no crazy arcing or anything like that. Make sure your points in here are touching correctly. They touch when this closes all the way. These points should touch. And then now we're done with this. Now this guy, we need to get a good amount of grease on. And creating a mess is optional. And now we're done with that. We just wanted to clean it up just a little bit. Make sure you clean it, get all the old grease off, which I'd already done. And then you want to just apply a light bit of grease to it so that it spins freely with no binding and everything moves as it should. The next step will be this guy. We're going to start putting it back together, which means we got to get this guy back in. This needs to go in first before you install the speedometer adapter. 100% this needs to go in first. So we're going to spray some grease on that. And then we drop this straight in. Make sure the bearing is seated, which you can see I just pushed it in there. We're going to take our hammer, gently tap, make sure it's seated. Do not strike this with a steel hammer or a cast iron hammer. Make sure it's at the minimum brass or aluminum, preferably plastic though. It will seat in by hand though, like I just did. Put a liberal amount of oil in there on each groove. Work it in. All right, now that we have this guy moving nice and free, we are going to install our worm gear. Now there are two ways to install this. The first way is simply aligning it and pushing it in, or you can use this plate, the one that holds it in, to pull it into its little pocket. You don't need to though. It should be able to press in by hand, by fingers. Just tap it in that way. Then you're going to want to take a little tiny pin. Be sure not to mar anything up. Just gently tap it, very gently tap it, to make sure it is seated. That's all you're doing. And then we are going to put the screws back in. You can pry this out and clean this guy out here, or just leave it, and then you're going to want to put a dab of oil, just standard 30 weight oil, to wet the seal. Now we're going to jump back over to our governor weights and play the fun game of getting these guys back down in. We're going to put the retaining plate over like this. All right, now we're going to install our governor spring tensioner. Make sure you get a good amount of grease on the shaft. This can just sit in here for the time being until we get this guy up to speed, the points and the solenoid. So we're going to apply grease here. And spray some grease down inside there. Then we need to reassemble these pieces. You can hear it's a tight fit. The hissing was from the adding of the grease. Make sure you have this face coated and the inside oil light surface. You can wipe it around, just get it all over everything. And then you need to attach this guy and spray some grease like that. And then these points are going to slide down on that while you line everything up. And it should just drop right in. It might take some shifting around to get everything moved where it needs to be. But should be able to get it pretty close. All right, now we're going to reinstall our screws in the side here to hold this plate on. And then remember, the longer screw goes on the farthest side. Make sure you have everything connected. This is moving as it should. As you can see, when I pull this guy up, it moves the points. Now we're going to reinstall our circuit board. The 3 inline blades go to the inside, and then the packaged blades, like how they're all assembled in one little spot, go towards the outside. We need to run the motor or turn the shaft so that it is on. We're moving everything to the other side. We're going to fish our wires through. They need to go underneath here. Everything needs to go underneath that. So this is where your forceps come in handy. Feed these guys through. The shaft so that it locks in correctly. One nut on. Make sure it's really tight. This is what holds the motor to the case, or just snug. Don't over tighten it, don't go crazy with it. And then we're going to flip it over, put in our another nut right there. We need to route our wires, get our ground plugged in correctly. We need to pull the wires through that need to be run. And then the red one needs to come through the top. The red wire needs to get run through this top section. That's very important, so that none of the wires get caught. Get the fork underneath the screw, and you're going to tighten that screw down. We are going to hook the black wire up. Then we're going to take a 12-volt source and go ahead and touch these contacts. So you're pushing this guy against that point, like so. And then we're going to tighten our black wire. And then we are going to run it back. All right, now we're going to hook wide open throttle switch right there. And now we're going to back this screw out slightly. And we're going to take our forceps and the screw, or I'm sorry, the nut. And you're just going to spin it on so that it's just a lot easier that way to spin it. Then you're going to tighten the screw back down. Make sure it's nice and tight. And then you need to thread this guy on. Now you don't want to over tighten that piece because it is plastic. Now we're going to put the fitting back in. This is what connects to the dial on the dash. I put some anti-seize on it. Doesn't need to be crazy tight, but it does need to be locked down. Now, we're going to put our rod back in. And you want to apply grease to the shaft, smear it around, and then you're going to want to get grease down in that groove as well. There's a groove on this back side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now there should be constant pressure on the spring, as in it doesn't feel loose inside. This should not, there's no end play is what I'm getting at. So it still compresses good, a lot better than it did before. We're going to put the throttle plates on, which we're going to put some grease. Goes like that. Going this way. Then you can reinstall your spring. Now to put the cover back on, we just need to reinstall our O-ring. I soaked this in some high mileage transmission additive. The additives will basically just help rejuvenate the rubber. Then we're going to take this guy, put him back in there. Make sure the felt seal is seated correctly all the way around. We can reapply this guy. Make sure this moves correctly, which it does. And then we can reinstall our screws. All right, now the final step is to install the speedometer adapter. So what we're going to do, we're going to spray some grease on that post that's inside there. And then we're going to layer this guy up with grease. Make sure you get the back side of the gear as well. And then you're going to fit it down inside. Just let it sit in there. Then you're going to take your adapter, spray some grease in there, make sure it covers all the sides. Then while it's inside the little container area, you can spray the shaft there. The reason I'm saying to leave it inside is so it spreads down in that little chamber. Then you're going to put this guy back on, like so, and reinstall the screws. make sure it's tight, and then make sure it spins correctly. And now you're done. That's it. You've rebuilt a cruise control unit for 61 Imperial and many other vehicles. Now, one thing I would like to talk about quickly before I let y'all go is basically if you're having issues with the cruise control, things you need to take a look at. And it starts with all of the switches that are in line. So you do have ignition power coming directly in to the into the unit from a brake pedal mechanical switch and a hydraulic safety switch. The hydraulic safety switch is located underneath the master cylinder. That guy right there. But if you can't get power correctly or you're having issues with it disengaging, take a look at this and then the dash button itself where the dial is located. If those are not working correctly, then the whole thing is not going to work as a whole. Now the same thing goes for your drive cables. If your drive cables are rattling around, you're probably going to have issues with instability on your speedometer and the needle bouncing everywhere, or in the case of the Imperial, the bar moving in a weird way. So there's definitely external factors that can play into whether the unit is working correctly or not. I would recommend you start with that, and then just keep everything lubricated. Simply spraying some spray grease down inside where all those little moving parts are that I just showed you is a great way to make sure that everything is moving correctly. Protecting that speedometer gear, the conversion gear underneath the unit, that is a very important thing that you should be putting grease on just to make sure that it is working correctly and not binding up at all. Thank you for reaching the end of the video. I really appreciate it if you've watched to this point. I really hope that this video helped someone out there, helped them understand, you know, whatever was going on inside this crazy mystery box, or, you know, it helped them get motivated to maintain it and grease the things inside of it so that it doesn't fail in the future and then you lose some important parts. Now, if you are going to get into adjusting it, you really need to have a manual. Like, that is, just use the manual. I'm not going to make a video on that. That should be, if you're willing to do that, you will have the manual to adjust it. I don't think you should be just going in, adjusting everything willy-nilly, just getting everything, you know, oh, I think it should be here. You need to truly take patience and adjust it to the correct standard that the manual lays out. So I would like some feedback on this video in the comments. If you feel I did a good job explaining this whole process, please let me know. If you think I did a poor job, let me know as well. And let me know if you enjoy these videos where I go in depth and I explain everything to the best of my ability so that more people can understand just how these things work and then hopefully be able to maintain them better. So please let me know in the comments what you think. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I really appreciate it every time that you guys leave a good comment. That seriously means a lot. I enjoy going through all the comments and answering the questions, or you know, just random comments. So I really appreciate it. I again appreciate you watching to this point. I hope you learned something in this video, and we'll see you in the next video. But until then, have a blessed one.